It's recording.
Recording is on.
There we go. Recording is started, and good evening, everybody that's here live. And if you're watching this recorded, hopefully you'll get a lot of good information out of what we're going to have for the next 4.5 hours. Because I know Sean's presentation is like 3 hours now. Welcome to the March virtual meeting, March 22nd here. We're zipping through 2021. And yeah, so let's get going on with this evening. See if I can. All right, so we got everybody connected. We're going to go through some opening announcements with everybody, kind of where we are, what we're doing. Then we're going to have Sean, Dr. Sean Murray, present. Looking forward to seeing his presentation. And then Skylar Town's going to be joining us later on, and we'll have his presentation. So it should be a lot of fun. Looking forward to it. We're here on the platform tonight, thanks to 8x8. Andy Jalbert is our contact. He had something else that came up. He's connected, but he had to take a customer call. But real appreciative of his support for the platform that we have, along with all of our other sponsors that we do have that's helped us out with the chapter over the years. The Intelligence Services Group with Bob Henderson. If you ever get a chance to chat with him when you need services, he's certainly worthwhile talking with. Our friends at Gold Sky, friends at Fortress InfoSec. And then, of course, once we get back into the real world and we're doing our presentations in person, back at Valencia, back at ECPI, and hopefully we'll be going to Full Sail as well, because we were right on the cusp of starting that one. If you've never attended one of our chapter meetings, well, welcome. We're real excited that you're here and hopefully get some good education. But pretty well, the ISC squared chapters are built on 4 pillars. The ability to get connected with your fellow cybersecurity professionals in the community or in the world, as we've got our 2 speakers here tonight aren't local. They are coming to us from various parts of the country. To provide some education for you, some insight and information. And then the Inspire and Secure is all about what you take away from it and go back out into your workforce or home to inspire you to secure. But other programs that we've got available through professional development training and the Safe and Secure Online program as well. So my name is James McQuiggan. If this is your first time, I'm the chapter president. We do have Walter Spielman, who is our vice president. He's on the call tonight. There he is, waving. Then we got Debbie Carr. She's our chapter secretary. And then we have Christopher Hickernell, who's the wonderful guy in the headset with the white polo shirt. We got Paul O'Connor, who's our treasurer. Amy Rooks, who handles our sponsorship. And then Tom Plummer, who handles our education. Tom, unfortunately, couldn't be here tonight. He had some car issues they had to take care of at home. So let's talk about some upcoming events. So tonight we've got March 22nd, our virtual meeting. And then for the next 3 months, we're still planning virtual meetings. Hopefully by June, we'll have a lot of people that have been vaccinated. For those of you that want to have it, we'll be able to have gotten it. And the schools might be opening up. We might be able to start getting some face-to-face, maybe a hybrid. The officers and I need to get together and discuss that. But right now we're tentative planned for June, the end of June, maybe July or August. We'll be able to do some in-person events again, hybrid. I know a lot of people have appreciated the fact that they can attend these meetings virtually. We might look at trying to see what it takes to do that going forward. We'll need a bit of a technology. We're going to need a bit of some support with that. So we're going to see how that goes. So last month in February, we did our book club, and we picked our next book, and it's Manipulated by Teresa Payton. And there's some bullet items there, what the book's about. But when we do this in May, so not next month, the month after next, when we do the book club, we're going to want 3 or 4 folks that have wanted to have read the book or have read the book. And we'll be wanting to be on a panel and discuss the book, things you liked about it, didn't like about it, concepts that were in there. So if you are interested, just drop us a note at our email address, info@isc2chapters-centralflorida.org, or visit the website. You'll see the email address there. But we're going to be looking for some folks to kind of be on the panel like we did last month. It seemed to go really well. A lot of folks liked it. So if you get an opportunity to read the book Manipulated and you want to participate, let us know. The book is really, really good. Great insights. So Other events we've got going on. I know ISSA just did their event last weekend on the 19th. They'll probably have theirs coming up in April. CSNP has I believe they've got a March event already planned. Citrusec still on hold, and then ISACA is on hold as well. I know SIM is meeting as well, the Society of Information Managers here in Central Florida, or the Orlando chapter. So they're still meeting too, so you're more than welcome to go check them out. All right, quick recap on our chapter membership info. 235 members. We're holding there really well. So appreciate everybody that's here tonight. We got 40 on the meeting tonight, so it's a good turnout. Yeah, so we're holding our own at 235. We have the training event coming up in next month. We had hoped, we're still working out some logistics. We have an April 17th date set, but we haven't got the contract signed, so I don't want to commit to that yet. Once we've got that, we'll get the registration open. I do apologize that we haven't been able to get to that yet. We've just got to work out some issues on the contract and just clarifying that. So once we've got that taken care of, we'll get registration open and we'll let everybody know, and you'll see the costs and everything else. All right, that's pretty well what I had lined up for announcements. Not a lot of stuff. We're just kind of going through the motions each month with our different presentations, and this month is no different. And I'm really excited that we've got Dr. Sean Murray here. I've known Sean for several years through my ISSA days and seen him at the various conferences. I think we've shared a couple scotches together. So but I'm real excited that I could get him here to present, because he's up in Denver as well, if I remember correctly, right, Sean? As you unmute.
Yeah, I'm actually spring.
Oh, okay. You broke up really a lot there. Hopefully that kind of kicks through for us as we get going, that your audio sounds good. So go ahead, Sean, turn it over. Go ahead and I'll stop sharing and you can go ahead and take over.
All right. Can you hear me better now?
Yes, that was
okay.
better.
All right. So let me go ahead and share out my screen and not hang up on myself like I did last time.
That's the whole trick.
All right. Can everybody see my screen?
We see the PowerPoint screen. Yep. Unless you're going in presentation mode.
All right. You see the full screen now?
Nope. I still just see the presentation, the PowerPoint mode itself.
Let's see.
Yeah.
How's that?
Does anybody else see the full screen? I still see the main PowerPoint.
Yep. Only see PowerPoint window.
Yep. Okay. I mean, you can go with it unless you've got transitions or anything. You could.
No, I don't do any of that kind of stuff.
Okay.
Let me try this again.
Oh.
Not sure why. I've got a full screen on my side, but I'm not sure why it's not doing it.
Yeah, I can see you're kicking off the slideshow, but it doesn't show us that.
Did you share a window instead of sharing a screen?
Now I shared an application, so let me try that.
Oh, you're only...
okay. Yeah, you may want to just share the desktop, because it's sharing this part of the application, not the slideshow application. That's the kicker.
Technology.
Gotta love it, man. Hey, oh no, it went back. I was like, oh, here we go.
How is that?
Still got the PowerPoint.
One more time. I'm going to share the entire screen. How's that?
All right. There we go.
But it won't let me do. Oh, there we go.
There's your screen. Okay, there we go.
How's that?
Yay!
Hey, well, I appreciate the invite, James. Yeah, James and I go way back. Yeah, we've been sharing whiskey and scotch and good conversations for many years, travel in the same circles. I appreciate the invite. I am also an officer, member at large for our local ISC Square chapter, which I helped start here God, it's got to be over 10 years ago. I also started up an ISC Square chapter, military chapter in Wiesbaden, Germany. That was back in 2013, 2014 timeframe. So, yeah, I enjoy participating in collaborating with other professionals. If you're on LinkedIn, you want to reach out, please let me know. Let me know that you're part of the Central Florida chapter. I don't just accept everybody. There's a lot of spam and people trying to sell your garbage out there. So again, I do appreciate the opportunity to come and present for you tonight. This is going to be more of a discussion, really. If you read the abstract in 2011 when I published my dissertation and dominated my brain to science, and now it's just mush. It focused on do we really need to connect everything to the internet? And it might be a discussion that we start having again. I know some organizations that I'm working with are starting to isolate, critical processes that don't really need to be connected to the internet. So does everything really need to be connected to the internet? An old approach to information security. So I'm going to look at 3 of the most significant hacks that we've seen over the last, say, 30 to 45 days, right? So Chinese advanced persistent threats and groups. The focus here is on Hafnim, the hacking group itself, not the last element that was actually officially added to the elemental chart. But we're looking at one of the most significant hacks to one of the most largest software companies in the world, right? So we're taking a look at significant actors with sophisticated capabilities. And at the state actor level, you're talking about a very well-resourced organization with lots of great skill sets that are very hard for organizations to combat. We're going to actually take a look at some of the impacts associated with different types of hacking groups, the malware that they introduce to us. This slide here basically looks at some of the most significant Chinese state actors or associated relationships with state actors coming out of China. So here, we're looking at the latest hack against literally happened 2 weeks ago or a week ago last Friday, right? And I've already had one incident with a local client who had a direct connection through a VPN tunnel into a multi-billion-dollar healthcare company who was affected specifically by this hack. We've done our incident, we've closed things up, and we're not getting a lot of transparency from the parent organization. And so we're going to have a follow-up conversation with the CISO and the CIO later on this week to close the loop on that, to include a sound communications plan, because there was nothing in place. All right, so we talk about this. This is the latest one, right? Targeting on-prem Exchange server software. They're the primary actor that we've seen using these exploits, which were discussed in detail by Mystic here in the presentation. So the attacks included 3 steps. First, it would gain access to an Exchange server either with stolen passwords or by using previously undiscovered vulnerabilities to disguise itself as someone who should have access. Second, it would create what's called the web shell to actually control the compromised server remotely. And then it would use the remote access, run from US-based private servers that are owned by the hacking group to actually steal data from the organization's network. Significant then in such that it was a 0-day, 3 or 4 different approaches on how to exploit this software, use a command and control to report back to these US-based remote servers that were obfuscated using VPN tunnels, kind of like a Tor technology. All right, the recent one associated with the Mac operating system, known as Silver Sparrow. This is still an unknown actor at this point in time. Activity cluster, which includes a binary compiled to run on Apple's new M1 chips, It's actually been discovered to work on ARM and Intel chips as well, and it's specific to the Apple architecture. Various types of capabilities. Red Canary was the first one to, the researchers at Red Canary were the first ones to disclose the research on this one. So again, Mac operating system malware using a launch agent to establish persistence. Uses JavaScript for execution, something not previously encountered in other Mac operating software. If you actually go to the Red Canary site, they will show you all of their research. So for those of you that are geeks and like to look at code as to how this stuff operates, they actually have all the code, all of the binaries, all of the call outs and the commands. I'm providing just a taste of what is happening with this malware here. So every hour, the persistence launch agent tells the launch D to execute a shell script that downloads a JSON file to disk, converts it into a plist, and then uses its properties to determine further actions. It's acting as a C2 server. So there's a command and control component that reaches back every hour. Download URL property gets checked for additional content to download, and then executes whatever the instructions are on the C2 server. After observing the malware for over a week, neither Red Canary nor their research partners like Malwarebytes, a couple of others, observed a final payload, leaving the ultimate goal of Silver Sparrow activity a mystery. What it's actually believed here in the community is that it was being set up initially to see what the capabilities were, and then at some point later looking at an ability to be able to execute additional malware or some other type of activity. But there was nothing in the observation from the researchers showing that it was actually executing anything. Then finally, this stuff can erase itself. So the payload, in addition to the payload mystery, Silver Sparrow includes a file check that causes the removal of all persistence mechanisms and scripts, cleans up the logs, checks for the persistence of specific library file here in the Mac operating system on the disk, and if the file is present, it removes all of its components from the endpoint, leaving no trace of the malware. All right, I think everybody's living on a rock if you haven't heard about the SolarWinds supply chain hack. So the one here specifically that I'm focused on is Sunburst, but these are all Russian state actors or related groups with some type of intelligence component back to Russia, or the intelligence community within Russia, or various state actors within Russia. So this was one of the largest, most sophisticated attacks ever, according to Microsoft. One of these, my audience here is a bunch of cybersecurity, professionals, right? So one of the things that we talk about for software assurance, and this is what drives me crazy with somebody like SolarWinds, a very large, well-known, well-funded, over 300,000 clients across the globe, over 18,000 that were affected by the Sunburst hack. Please explain to me why you're not following industry best practices in developing your patches and the signatures for your patches. All the great things that you're doing, like developing the signatures, digitally signing them to ensure integrity. Explain to me why an organization like SolarWinds has got an environment that's connected to the internet. If you're developing in a development environment, that development environment shouldn't be connected to the internet. It should be separate from the test environment, because once you've developed what you're looking to achieve, that product needs to be tested in an emulated environment, right? And so then we move that to the staging environment. How do we stage? Are we going to stage it directly through digital signature and through a subscription service? Are we going to push it out to our clients and our customers? And then, of course, then it gets integrated into prod, the 4 stages of DevOps, right? So why was their development process connected to a network which was accessed by, a state actor suspected, and it was the perfect mechanism. So you've got Russia, state actor, allegedly gets access to their environment, monitors the development environment, modifies the signature, adds the malware, and then gets the vendor to digitally sign and distribute out the malware, right? So again, I go back to, why was this environment connected to the internet? We don't normally have our software development connected to a network that's connected to the internet. So here are the affected products from the SolarWinds Orion platform. So the versions that were affected here, once they got into it, it affected a lot of their products and their product suites. Of course, they charge separately for a lot of these capabilities, but these were the known affected products on the Orion platform. All right, so what I mean to do is actually have a discussion with you as professionals. So old school approach, debate or discussion. Why? Why do we need to not have everything absolutely connected to the internet? Nearly 80% of our business processes are automated. All right, loss in productivity. I go back to 2011 when I presented my dissertation. Well, when you present your dissertation, you have to present it several times, and it has to be peer reviewed. And let me tell you, my peers wanted to hang me up by my toes. Everybody thought that I was backward thinking. Loss of intellectual property. We're actually going to take a look at what it's actually costing the world in the United States. Attacks on critical infrastructure are just a matter of time. We had the issue in Texas with a bad winter storm that demonstrated just how bad it can really be. No water, no potable water, no electricity, no distribution or effective distribution for generators for fuel or priority in your disaster recovery plans. Cyber attacks are getting more sophisticated with advanced persistent threats, state actors. The idea here is, when I presented this, it really wasn't from a cybersecurity perspective. I presented it because of productivity. In 2011, $251 billion was lost in productivity with people misusing the internet, all right, at work. So $251 billion, that's a lot of money in productivity. What do you, so let me ask the group, what do you think the most significant, the top 3 things were that people were doing misusing the internet at work because they were connected? And go ahead and unmute yourselves and just give me your thoughts. What do you think they were?
Facebook.
So Facebook, social media was number 3.
Shopping.
Shopping was in the top 10, but not in the top 3. What month is it, everyone?
No. Checking email.
No, what month is it?
Taxes?
March Madness.
March Madness was number 2.
YouTube.
No, YouTube classifies as social media.
Social media.
NSC football was the number 1 most disruptive work productivity activity in the entire workplace. You had some people managing 7 to 8 teams and taking up a significant amount of time. March Madness was bad because not only were they managing all their brackets, but they were also streaming a lot of the games because they're accessible on the internet. So what do you think that was doing to your IT services, right? So those are trying to get some real work done. The degradation of the network was pretty significant. And these are more related to the very large organizations and corporations. But again, so old school approach. Why do we need to connect absolutely everything to the internet? So here's a special report. Go ahead.
Nope, sorry. I know Steve. So sorry.
Okay. So here's a special report on cyber warfare for the C-suite, sponsored by Intrusion Incorporated. So this was basically published by Steve Morgan, editor-in-chief, back in November of last year. If you go out to this site, you can actually download the report. If it were measured as a country, then cybercrime, which is predicted to inflict damages totaling $6 trillion just here in the United States, globally, trillion US dollars globally in the globally in 2021. So this is global, would be the world's third largest economy after the United States and China. This is directly out of their report. Cybersecurity Ventures expects global cybercrime costs to grow by 15% each year over the next 5 years, reaching 10.5 trillion US dollars annually by 2025, up from 3 trillion US dollars in 2015. This represents the greatest transfer of economic wealth in history. Risks the incentives for innovation and investment is exponentially larger than the damage inflicted from natural disasters in a year, and will be more profitable than the global trade of all major illegal drugs combined. All right, so in my dissertation, I proposed a three-tiered architecture. A three-tier architecture. So I would ask those of you who have worked for the government on classified and unclassified networks, you are not unfamiliar with this proposal. Having worked in the government sector for most of my career, it's blatantly obvious that with specific network architectures that allow you to keep internal communications internal, we have technology now, like look at the Citrix, the workspace, for example. You have the ability to spin up a virtualized work environment that provides no ability to transfer data from the host, the endpoint running the VM, to the workspace environment that is being run on an organization server, right? So three-tiered architecture proposal: a closed network with no internet connection. So a medium to large business can enclose without having an external connection to the internet and be able to perform its day-to-day activities. So not every single person in the organization absolutely needs access to the internet to be able to do their job. All right, they may need access to the network, but an extended network and providing an environment to be able to be productive can be achieved. All right, the next architecture approach is either having a laboratory or like some type of community access, like going to the public library, jumping on a computer that has access to the internet. Those that need intermittent use of the internet could go into a controlled environment, go and do whatever that work was that was required to be done in that laboratory or community access library type environment. Today it's even easier. You don't even need to do that. You can hit a switch and navigate to a system that will be similar to that environment. So remember, this was 2011, before we had a lot of the technology that we have today. I mean, we're talking 10 years ago. And then separate you can have a separate internet capable environment as well, where those who have require constant access to the internet have that capability. Again, with the technology that we have today, a lot of this can be spun up as a VM or emulated environment with extensions using software, right? Augment the argument that not all things need to be connected to the internet. We already do this on the government networks now, classified versus unclassified networks. One of the biggest challenges for organizations to be able to set up any type of architecture like this is that the government needs to release or ease its restrictions on the use of strong encryption devices like that the government uses. And so without the ability to be able to use strong encryption devices, on the government side, I'm looking at KVs and and other types of devices where we actually use encryption keys, that are produced on a periodic basis and then provided into those encryption devices to secure what we call type 1 encryption across the internet. We send, the highest classified information encrypted, tunneled over the internet. We've got to be able to have an ability to protect the organization at different tiers and levels. And so, again, I wanted this to be more of a collaboration between us as professionals. What are your thoughts? 10 years ago, everybody wanted to hang me up. The 10 years before that, we weren't connected to the internet. Everything was either dial up or, we just operated on an enclosed network. So I'd like to open up for questions or comments.
Hey, Sean, I think one of the biggest arguments to your proposal is the business, the organization's perimeter is dissolving and collapsing. And the well-defined interior, squishy part of the organizations is becoming distributed. The workforce is becoming distributed, and those workloads are becoming distributed. So the need for perimeter security is getting pulled all the way back to the endpoint, all the way back to the user. And the ability to secure communications through single point encryption devices is no longer needed.
Yeah, given a global pandemic, right? I think your point is absolutely well taken. Distributed, remote, on-prem, there's a significant push now that people aren't going to go back to on-prem. So then the proposal is, how do we create an environment that doesn't provide the threats that we're receiving today? And at the beginning of at the chapter meeting, there was discussion amongst yourselves that I was listening to about all the scams. Scams globally are up 900%. And people are being affected, the elderly, the kids, the youth. Everyone's being targeted, and the significant amount of wealth is being extracted, using some of these mediums as well. What are some other ideas out there? Very well, put, and I don't think it's going away. So I agree with you.
So one of the things that I'm dealing with, or discussions and presentations, is around the whole supply chain. And you touched upon the solar winds and everything else. How, with so much, and leaning into Christopher's previous question with the whole perimeter, shifting, when we have so many third-party vendors, the supply chain, but the third party integrating into our environment, how does that fit in with that model? Do we create some sort of layered infrastructure, that the low end ones don't need to be on the internet? But how do you see that, trying to get the control and maintain the supply chain folks coming in?
Yeah, so, and this is what they were doing well, right? They were digitally signing, all of their code and their patches. So full disclosure, I've had a conversation since with somebody who's in the know on the development process at SolarWinds. They're distributed, back to the initial point that was made, right? The software developers are distributed across the globe. They are all contributing to the software development process, and to be able to do that, they need to be connected to the internet. So that's what we ended up finding out about the development environment, is you've got people working from home on SolarWinds computers, but all of those resources have to be connected to the internet. As far as supply chain goes, it's turning into one of the most significant things. We used to think supply chain, and we were looking at counterfeit devices. Cisco and chipsets were the big ones, 10 years ago. Now we're looking at software assurance. I have always stated that, the most significant threat, I think everybody knows, is the human, right? I have always said that number 2 is software. Why? Number 1, software is developed by, humans. Number 2, we've never had a focus, since we started developing software, to ensure that we're not just making it functional, but also making it secure. And how do we do that? What's the best practice for ensuring that it's not only functional, but it's secure? We always know that baking security in is preferred over trying to strap it on later on, because it might not operate as intended. But when we talk about supply chain now, especially for software, we're looking at technologies like blockchain. We're looking at things that can provide that level of integrity throughout the entire process. In working with a blockchain organization here with the state of Colorado, where they're looking at the national digital identities, and they're going to start with academics. If you tried to transfer your transcript from a degree program recently, that they don't mail those out anymore. Parchment, I believe, is the number one distributor of your credentials when you're applying for a job or trying to get into another school. So something similar to that type of technology, which provides that distributed ledger with a chain of integrity from the beginning point all the way up to whoever the subscriber or the receiver is. It's just one of the technologies that I see that is being used to address some of the supply chain issues.
Cool. Let's see. Any questions in the chat? Nope. Bounties, not ransoms. Yeah, if you guys got questions, drop them in the chat and I'll read it out, or unmute. If you raise your hand, I don't know if I'll be able to see it because we got a lot of squares here.
And I did provide these slides out to James so he can post those.
Get those to everybody. So what do you see as some of the bigger challenges? I mean, with what with all with your company, with your organization that you have and that you're supporting, what are some of the biggest challenges that you mentioned? And I'm going to tap in because that's my area where I work. But where you talk about the humans are the weakest link, what are the organizations doing right and what are they doing wrong? Well,
so I guess one of the things that I love about my job, as a consulting company, I get to the lessons learned, like this big one here, with this, multi-billion-dollar healthcare organization. It took me, I've got a fairly good network, but it still took me 4 hours to get a hold of the CISO and the CIO at this healthcare organization. We severed, so this healthcare organization is a client of our company, the one that I represent as the virtual CISO. And we pass data, information back and forth. It's a credit collections company. And so they collect debt on behalf of the healthcare organization, but there's files being transferred back and forth all day, securely. But there's a VPN connection that with firewall rules that are, we identified last October, like, look, when we do the assessment, we can't touch that VPN connection. We can see 1,600 endpoints on the other end of that. That's somebody else. And so, the tough part was here are the things that we end up learning, and these are the lessons learned. It shouldn't have taken me 4 hours to be able to communicate with the CISO or a CIO to get credible information back from that organization. What had happened was we got notified through one of our employees got a text message saying from the healthcare organization saying, hey, look, I think I'm the last one on email. We've been hacked. It's a huge Microsoft hack. We're not sure what's going on yet, but over 4,000 employees have been affected at this point, and they're not sure when they're going to be resolved this. So immediately we spin up the incident response team. We sever the connection, but now we have no ability to actually fulfill the contractual obligation that my client has to the healthcare provider. And so after 4 hours and ambiguous, I couldn't, I sent an email off, but it was very ambiguous, sensitive topic, please contact me, because I didn't know who was, on their email system. And then when I finally have I ended up getting an employee who gave me the CISO's telephone number, managed to leave him a message. He called me back and we were able to resolve it. But communications plan with each vendor. So I've now advised my client, as part of our communications plan, we need to have them with each one of the vendors that we have a contractual relationship with. And we, as a vendor service provider to clients, need to have, I don't want to have to go through that again. That's just too long.
Right.
And so take my lesson learned and go back and take a look at your vendors. Because if you have a cyber issue, or if they have a cyber issue, how quickly are you able to resolve that and communicate effectively through a trusted person? Who is that trusted person? And we've got scams going on, right? So how do you prevent it from social engineering attack, which was suspected by the healthcare organization? Well, who's this guy? We don't know Sean Murray. And he quickly, he was able to quickly determine that I was legit. And we had the conversation, but had no idea regarding the complexities of 3 different connections that we had to his organization. He thought it was web-based through a public URL. So there's a problem there as well, not understanding, what's connected to your network.
True. Anybody else have questions? Discussion, add to the discussion? Quiet group tonight.
Well, I do hope, some of my pain you can take back to your organizations and maybe ask a couple questions. I have another client that was affected by the entire Texas winter storm. They're a construction company that have been around since the 1800s. Their primary office is in Austin. They have another office in San Antonio and another office in Dallas. And all of them were down, and it affected them significantly. Their generators couldn't be refueled because they didn't have a priority rating for delivery of fuel to the generators. And so almost the entire workforce that wasn't in the office actually had to start working remotely. And some of them were affected with power outages for well over a week.
So we got one question that came in, wanting to get a little more insight on the corporate network configuration you were talking about. I need a computer to produce my deliverables. How do I share my output? USB/disk/ ?
Yeah, that's called SneakerNet, right?
SneakerNet. Yep.
Yeah, I don't know that. Maybe if you're working R&D, but again, we can do closed architecture, network architectures to be able to do our jobs using encryption, end-to-end encryption. Even if I'm a VPN, the attack then is that VPN from the adversary. But the architecture, similar to what I'll just stick with the Department of Defense, for example. So we have our unclassified networks, and we actually have all of the same things a regular organization does to try and protect the endpoint from the user and the user's behaviors, right? We've got SolarWinds, we've got antivirus, we've got a host-based intrusion detection, we're using web filtering, all of that stuff for the unclassified network. But for the sensitive, or what we call classified, so at the secret level, we use what we call KV175, KG175s, or KIVs, that what we call ComSec custodian. That's a person who's responsible for the encryption devices, issuing the encryption keys, and changing those keys on a periodic basis. That is been effectively unbreakable I don't know of any instance where the type 1 encryption that's used by the government using those types of devices has ever been compromised. Now, people have gotten onto the unclassified network that weren't supposed to be on there, but that was physical access. And then, of course, we have it at the top secret level, and we have it at compartmented levels as well. And so, again, we're using the same type of technology. So if I'm in research and development or intellectual property in a laboratory environment, you can still have that environment, even in a distributed environment. What I'd say, it's an investment in your technology. It's an investment in the government releasing its restrictions on the type of encryption and encryption devices that organizations can use. I mean, I get it. They've been trying to control encryption. In many countries, outlaw the use of encryption. Or if you bring in strong encryption devices that are not native to that country, you can actually be arrested. So, but it comes down to the strength of the encryption and the ability to integrate a distributed architecture today, as the initial point was made, to be able to securely perform your business processes.
Cool. Got a question here. What do you think about the Gartner SASE and Zero Trust?
So we just actually did a SASE at ISSA International. We did a panel with, there were several of us, and the SASE is a concept of integrating a security kind of like it's not blockchain, but it's kind of the same concept, where all your applications are trusted using that concept. So if you're not familiar with this is a, I think it was Fortinet was the sponsor, and they've got one of these solutions. So go out and research this technology if you're not familiar with it. But the idea is to provide a level of trust between applications, endpoints, and distributed architectures. So I don't know that anybody's doing it absolutely perfect yet. If you take a look at what happened with SolarWinds, if you're pushing updates and you're pushing trust through a development environment that can be compromised, it's not going to help. But the concept is being well received, and it's come out in the last about 15 months, this new concept. But good question, and to everyone else, if you're not familiar with it, go research that.
Check it out.
Yeah, we just did a webinar. In fact, I think that webinar is available at the ISSA International site. So we publish those. If you're a member of ISSA, you can get access to that.
Check it out. Yep. Yeah, a lot of our members we're all triple threats.
Yeah.
ISSA, IAC squared, InfraGard. Yeah. So Eric was asking, what about voice communication? Right now, most companies are using some type of VoIP. So what about security around that?
Yeah, so that's always a great conversation when we do assessments out with our clients. We expect that, for best practice, it should be on its own dedicated separate network. You should be encrypting it using sound encryption. It was one of the big issues when we transitioned during the pandemic. Zoom was providing free stuff for everybody, but they were riddled with all kinds of vulnerabilities. Zoom bombing was a big thing where people were just taking over, telecommunications. But yeah, use a sound VoIP solution. Cisco's got one of the better ones I've seen. It's well integrated. You can run your own security configurations on it. Use a call manager that requires, a secure access code. Change the access code on a periodic basis. You shouldn't be using the same one, or you might have people listening and, in on conversations that you don't intend to.
Exactly. Yep. Any other questions, comments from anybody? Eric says thank you. Cool.
Well, I'm going to go ahead and pass this back to you.
All right.
I do appreciate everyone, inviting me, and it was an honor to be able to present to your chapter.
No, it was great having you. And like I said, one of the perks, the few perks of these virtual meetings is the fact that I can get speakers, colleagues that I've known for years to come and present without having to travel to Orlando and incur any business expenses and all that other good stuff. But no, it was great. I appreciate your time, Sean. And you're coaching soccer tonight, is that right?
No, I actually have a soccer game, and
You're playing, okay.
Oh yeah, so yeah, they don't have an over 40 or an over 50 league, so I play in the over 30 league.
Oh,
Try
geez.
to keep up with these young people.
The young whippersnappers. Wow, cool. Well, again, thank you. And I do have the presentation. I'll make it available to everybody. Don't forget, reach out to Sean on LinkedIn. He's always posting good articles and good links and good information. Certainly somebody that's worthwhile following on LinkedIn, whether you're at the beginning of your career, middle, and whatever. Just I know Sean's very active on LinkedIn and always like his stuff that I see. So cool. Again, thank you, Sean. All right.
Everyone.
Thanks. All right. So what I want to do real quick before I introduce our next speaker, I saw Skylar's on, which is great. So, but one of the great things that makes up this chapter is the officers that I have, and they're always keeping me on my toes and always keeping me, making sure I don't forget stuff. And I forgot to mention something that's really important because it's that time of the year where it's our elections. And my time and Debbie's time as secretary are the elections, the term of it runs for about 2 years. And Debbie and I got reelected back in January of 2019. We shifted it last year because of the way we had hoped to do our annual meetings. And then COVID hit and it totally screwed everything up. So right now, April is still our elected time. So the way it kind of works is the president and the secretary are they're 1 year, and then the following year it's the vice president, membership, and treasurer. The reason we do it that way is that way there's always at least some overlap, but also there's not one person in, both people could end up leaving that's in charge of the money. So that way, we've got that staggered between. Just to kind of give you guys a breakdown, we've got a couple minutes here, but just to give you kind of a breakdown, the elected officer positions are the president, the secretary, the vice president, the treasurer, and membership director. The sponsorship and education directors are appointed, and they run for as long as they want to do the position. So they're not elected actually by the membership, which is the power of you of the members that you have is being able to elect the people into the position. So I was elected into the role of president back in January of 2017. For those of you that have been in the chapter that long, I appreciate it. I know we've got a couple folks here on tonight. I got reelected January 2019, so now the end of my term is coming up, so there's that reelection process if I'm going to put my name in. Secretary Debbie, same thing. She was appointed in 2018. The previous secretary we had, she did for about a year. Debbie, then she was stepping down. That was Maureen. Debbie said, "Hey, I'm interested." So as one of the responsibilities and tasks that I have is being able to appoint people midterm. And then she was reelected 2019. Walter was our membership. He came on board, I think around the same time in January of 2018, or shortly thereafter in February. And then when our Fabiola was the vice president at the time, she stepped down. Walter was elected. And then he was reelected last year. Because Walter stepped up or was elected to president, they opened up the membership, and Christopher took that in September of 18. He was appointed. He was reelected last year. And then Paul was appointed last September because Scott, who was our treasurer beforehand, he moved away. And so we miss him, but we're glad we got Paul. He was reelected April of last year. So just gives you guys you all a quick rundown of how the positions have been since I've been president since January of 2017. So if you are interested in becoming an officer of the chapter, we have to hold the elections. It's part of the bylaws. If you want to be considered to be elected in one of the officer positions, you have to be a member of ISC squared and have one of the certifications and be a member of good standing with us and with ISC squared. That's kind of one of the caveats there. If you are interested, please send us an email to the info@isc2chapter.centralflorida.org website. Let us know who you are and what position, whether it's president or secretary. But please do so by what was the original tax day. Now it's been pushed out, but by April 15th. After that, we will then hold elections. We'll put all the names in for president and secretary. And then you, as the members, it's your responsibility to elect. I believe we need to have 50% or 51% of the membership vote. And out of 235, we'll probably be around that number. We need probably a good 120 people to vote for the officer positions for it to be able to count. If it doesn't count, then it falls to the officers to make the vote. So we want our members to vote so that you all have a voice in that. And then we will announce the president secretary position April 26th at our next meeting next month. So if you're curious, you can go out to the website. We've got the descriptions of the roles of president and secretary. So you can go out and check that out if you need some more information, or you're welcome to email us as well. So I think that's what I had there. I wanted to make sure that got out and make sure everybody was aware of it. I believe Skylar's on the line. Skylar, you there, sir?
Yes, I am.
Fantastic. Cool. I'm going to stop sharing, and then you should be able to start sharing your screen.
Excellent. So I am actually going to just share my face with y'all.
Oh, I love it.
I do have detailed and well-organized notes that I'll send along to you that you can share afterwards.
Okay, great.
But yeah, for the most part, I'll just be talking to everybody.
Fantastic. Wow.
All right.
Take it
Awesome.
away, Skylar.
Thank you very much. So yeah, I'm Skylar Town. This is probably the first time I've given a talk in like 5 years, and that was after almost a decade of my life giving talks, half of the year, constantly. So I really appreciate you all providing the opportunity and an audience. Opportunity to teach over the years, but again, nothing that was just sort of a public talk like I used to do. So some of this draws on my history of security technology background, but a lot of it is informed by some analytical methodologies that I've become more familiar and comfortable with over the years, and in general is sort of putting forth this theory of security technologies as bulwarks behind which much more fragile, iterative, but ultimately stronger systems that better secure a society are able to be developed. My background was originally as a competitive lockpicker. I really enjoyed that a lot. I think that coming out of the world of competitive lockpicking and into the world of history and anthropology gave me an interesting perspective on this, in particular because that first time that you open a lock, it goes differently for a lot of people. For me, it was absolutely thrilling, and I still had no idea what was going on inside the thing. And then as soon as I got back home from having learned how to pick a lock, I picked and broke the front door of the apartment that I lived in. And my landlord thought that was hilarious and left it up to me to figure it out. And we had secondary access through my roommate's room. And so now anytime I wanted to get into our shared space, I was moving through his private space. And that was an uncomfortable, almost 10 days of sort of negotiation and fragile peace between the two of us with this stupid mistake that I had made and how long it was taking me to fix it. And in the process of fixing it, I learned about the internals of this, and I sort of put it all together. And within the course of, about 2 weeks, I had a vastly different perspective and ultimately had a new layer of abstraction from which I was able to view the world around me. Those ideas of public and private spaces, of where I belong versus where I am going to be transiting through, the very idea of the security technology as not actually the thing that is keeping us safe, but instead these negotiated relationships and the things that security technology actually stands in for. Now, none of this is to say that I came out of this experience thinking, well, why do any of us bother having locks if locks are so easily picked? Quite the contrary. After years of sort of thinking about these things and finally getting access to sort of a better defined education that was able to fill in kind of the Swiss cheese in my experience of this, I really and truly came to believe that big changes in security technologies presage or in fact are sometimes simply caused by major transitions in the societies that those technologies are introduced in. Now, a lot of my work early on, one of my biggest sort of history projects was on the origin of the key-based lock and proposing a new theory for the origin, which for the previous couple hundred years had been believed to be of Egyptian origin, approximately 4,000 years old, so on and so forth. The history of why we believe that is super interesting in and of itself, but in the course of doing this work, I was able to go back and see that it more likely was established in Mesopotamia, but around the same time, and it moved to Egypt pretty soon thereafter, and it seemed like a really narrow distinction. And at the time, quite a while ago now, many years ago, I said, but by establishing this window, by trying to get closer to knowing when, maybe we can understand why. And then that's what I've been doing for the last 8 years or whatever it's been. So this talk is broken up into 3 big chunks. Antiquity, we'll talk a little bit about those origins. We're going to talk quite a bit about Britain from about 1770 to 1870, and then we'll talk a little bit about the modern era, what is differentiated in our modern security systems, what makes the problems that we need to solve unique, but also how, just like in these other 2 eras, the technology itself is only a piece of what's keeping us safe, and that technology permeates into our culture. It becomes often part of the popular culture, and additionally, we have all of these other systems, social systems, legal systems, infrastructural changes that create a safer and frankly more ubiquitous security than any security technology can provide. So going into antiquity. Abbas Alizadeh, phenomenal researcher at the University of Chicago's Oriental Institute, was going over and published a massive book, on the early state organization in prehistoric Highland Fars. Anyway, this piece of Iran and very, very, very old, prehistoric. But it was this sort of first inkling of a proto-state in a civilization, a civilization coming out of what had been a tribal society. And the cornerstone of Abbas's belief, the site that he was reviewing, not himself excavating, he was actually going through the findings of 2 prior excavations and combining all of this and putting forth the theory. But he said explicitly that door sealings, this very first security technology of door sealings, may be taken as the earliest tangible evidence of the evolutionary transition from a tribal to a civilized society. And so right there, at the moment of the birth of our first human security technology, and I mean a technology that secures our spaces, that defines those spaces, in its inception, that relationship between the development of society and the creation or evolution of the security technology are explicitly intertwined. And in fact, the mere existence of it is what gives Abbas his initial evidence that this is our first sort of state organization. Because if you have door sealings, that implies that there is some penalty for going through them. That implies that there are people being routed and that we are all agreeing upon the fact that those people should be routed. And this is the technology that determines the difference between private and public space or shared spaces, so on and so forth. And very quickly we see effectively proto-master keying, where individual areas of this community, you would see the seals of a handful of families repeated in different places. But one or two families in particular, their seals would show up everywhere. So they clearly had access to everything. They had the master to the community. Others had access to certain storage areas, so on and so forth. And it was this differentiation of the private and public space that was made possible and created the necessity for the security technology that was our first connection between social development and technological change and security. So around 3200 to 2500 BCE, that is the window in which I theorize that we got our first key-based lock, our first pin lock. The background on that is certainly interesting, but in particular, the central component of the door seal, the peg, the shikatu, is also the same word given, the same language used for the central locking element in the pin lock, literally the peg. So the peg that's put through into the door seal is sealed around. That same word is used for the pins in the shikatu lock. So that linguistic evolution implies a mechanical evolution, and so on and so forth. It's certainly an interesting path. But taking the step back and trying to ask that question of, okay, we have an idea of when. Now, if we're trying to understand why, where we get that linguistic connection, where we're able to see as the language changes, which we believe implies the same transition of the technology, is when we start seeing security officers known as the keepers of those locks being established in the royal courts in Assyria. And it is this, once again, our next major transition of a security technology is tied explicitly to an absolute transformation of state organization and societal organization. So these security officers, who were like named in the roles of officers in the court, would literally hold the pins in their hands. And if you wanted to lock a door, you would have one of them come. They would, like a locksmith, install the pins in the lock, take the key with them, and your door would now be locked, and you would need this person back in order to unlock it. It would also typically be protected by a human being in most cases, early two-factor authentication. But yeah, we once again, early on see this transition. Now, interestingly, and the other point of this, it isn't just you would expect to see these things happen, but also that locks offer us, that security technologies generally offer us more security than their mechanical nature allows. So specifically, if we're looking back, one of the more interesting things is when you look at Hypostyle Hall at the ruins at Karnak. This is where Vivant Denon, who was traveling with Napoleon back in 1798 and rediscovers the pin lock, that Europe had kind of forgotten about this technology. But he, sees carved on a wall the pin lock, and he sees all around him these pin locks. And eventually, through the linguistic analysis, we see that the pin lock goes back further and further. But what's particularly exciting is that if you look at Karnak, other areas of Karnak, which was built over the course of 1,000 years, so making sure that we're actually looking at sites that were concurrent with one another, we can see inscriptions of rituals that involved the door seal and the breaking of the seal in the morning and the removal of the shikatu and the greeting of the idol to the god and so on and so forth. These ritual practices that are recorded and concurrent, we know, with the existence of the technology that supplanted it, which to me demonstrates that original door seal not only was a useful tool in routing people and beginning to aid in the organization of the state, but it so permeated the culture that it actually became a part of ritual, that the lock, though supplanted by a superior technology and the social system supplanted by far more complex and stable ones, the technology itself had become part of the culture and ritual because it signified security. It signified the opening of private spaces and so on and so forth. And if you take that further and you look at the city laments, which are a series of absolutely beautiful epic poems written in cuneiform that describe the destruction of Sumer and Ur in detail, usually talking about the will of the gods and floods coming and so on and so forth, but it's all pretty explicit metaphor for literal hordes of attackers coming in and destroying the cities. As you read through this, there are sense memory passages where they describe what the community was like, the smells that you would smell, the sounds that you would hear when things were at peace. And then they similarly bring you through this, they upend those senses in a really powerful way, take you through that destruction when the songs that the cowherds would sing were silenced, when the smell from the tannery is gone from the air and replaced by that of smoke and so on and so forth. And one of the items that they call out specifically and that they come back to is that the sound of the bolt sliding shut at the end of the day would be that sense of peace and relief and comfort for everyone. And then they upend that with the horror of the silence of that bolt, because there's literally no one left alive to throw it, and the doors themselves have been wrenched off of their hinges. And frankly, the way in which they describe the sound of that, we can make a pretty reasonable prediction for the type of hinge technology, which is absolutely unrelated to this talk, but fascinating to think that we could reconstruct that. Okay, so I don't have a strong sense of the legal structure that far back, but this does also permeate legal structure. In fact, one of the more interesting transitions that we see, especially coming into the 1700s in Britain, is that effectively the more stable a society becomes, the lesser the penalty for housebreaking. So typically it was death, and very frequently, and this is a recurring theme, not only would somebody who had broken into a home be killed, but they would often be hung in the doorway of the place that they broke into, which sounds like a punishment for everyone. The stable society, the more we see that break away, and there are certainly punishments, but they're no longer fatal punishments. Quite frankly, this talk is boiled down from what is effectively a 6-hour lecture, so I'm not going to go get too deep into any one of these periods, but that is similarly fascinating, watching how laws around entry in public and private spaces also continue to evolve, especially as we can compare the strength of those laws, the leniency of those laws against the stability of a society, and see how the security technologies that individuals would have in particular stagnate. So the longer the stable society, the longer the technologies tend to stagnate. Okay, but let's bring this into a slightly more modern era, as the mid 1700s in Britain. So this is another period of significant transition in many ways, and one that's sort of forced by a number of factors. It's a fascinating period in general. But starting in the early mid 1700s, we start to see a significant rise in property crime and the establishment of this sort of permanent criminal underclass. This comes from a lot of things, but one of the more interesting aspects is this is sort of the birth of the criminal fence, somebody that can take in a large number of goods and then redistribute them, pay off a portion of them, and frankly have a form of sort of state organization of crime. And this leads to people that can make a sustainable living stealing property, breaking into houses, so on and so forth. Whereas, typically you holding your box of, necklaces and a sword or whatever else you got out of the place would have a hard time getting rid of that. Now you have somebody dedicated to it, so property crime skyrockets. So a number of things are quickly implemented. A number of things are called for to improve all of this, and a lot of it is legal and political power and systems. A good amount of it are like significant policing reforms is, interestingly, this whole era that we're covering with the development of the locks also tracks with the development of modern policing in Great Britain, which is a fraught, at times disastrous period of constant transitions. A lot of corruption, not a lot of trust, terrible organization, absolutely perverse incentives, but eventually, and frankly, before the end of this era of the idea of perfect security, it has come fully into being and resembles very much a more modern police force, and is much more effective and has significant amounts of trust. Additionally, you have major infrastructural projects like the advent of gaslighting, especially public gaslighting. This is an iterative and fraught and largely protested process where we have, individual commercial installing these things to show how safe they are, and then sometimes they explode. And there was always this big element of people that wanted to be able to light the streets at night. There were a lot of also, there was this system of moving about in the night of torch boys, where you would, give somebody a couple of cents and they would run you with a torch to another kid with a torch, and they would take you the rest of the way. But very frequently, they would just be taking you somewhere to be robbed. So it wasn't very safe to be out at night, and night provided a lot of cover for people that were housebreaking, so on and so forth. So gaslighting was a big public safety push that took financial investment, significant, just like digging in the ground, like labor to get this done, incredible political will, and the sort of education and convincing of the public, along with rapid development of the technology. And that isn't how locks are made. Locks are starting around 1770. Robert Barron rolls into the Royal Society and says, really updated our 250-ish years. In the 1500s, we start to see spring locks, which you could kind of think of as a single tumbler lever lock today. But they were single acting. Without getting into the details, they were incredibly easy to open effectively. You just needed to snake something in there and slide it open. Very similar to modern warded locks, with minimal difference. And then before that, it really was just warded locks. The concept of the pin lock was largely restrained to Africa. A lot of people there still using them. In fact, it clearly fell down off of my wall, but this is an old pin lock from a community in Africa. The technology continued to exist, but Europe and certainly Great Britain had completely forgotten about it, and so they were relying on a very old and pretty old technology. But Robert Barron rolls. Here is the double acting lever lock, a single tumbler, still single spring. Presents this. It is a massive improvement. Other people start riffing on this, and there is a big both social and financial incentive to create a solution that banks and consumers and landlords and so on and so forth can get and implement relatively quickly, because they're finding that what they have is useless against what they're up against. So Joseph Brahma is observing as Barron presents this for the first time to the Royal Society, and he writes a letter, and in the letter that he writes, he basically says, hey, that's a great idea. Here are all the ways I think it could be improved on, and also, I have no interest in doing that work myself. Here is my plan for an absolutely bonkers lock that none of you have ever thought of before. And very frequently, actually, the inspiration for his lock is attributed to the Egyptian lock. But England was yet to rediscover that for another 20 plus years. So what he comes up with out of almost whole cloth winds up being the Brahma safety lock. And this lock, which it takes him another 7 or 8 years after conception to actually make, because the equipment to make it didn't exist. And he meets somebody and they go into a business relationship and so on and so forth. But from the mid 1780s through 1851 specifically, no one opens his lock. It's opened once very early on. He makes a very slight adjustment, and he famously puts a lock in the window of his shop in Piccadilly, and no one opens it. And while it took him, 7-8 years in order to go from conceiving of his lock to actually being able to put it in the hands of everybody around him, Barron's lock was already a massive improvement, and many people iterated on that more quickly. And right off the bat, within the course of about 10 years, what a consumer, in particular, a bank or a landlord or somebody with some means could get their hands on as far as the security technology was concerned was massively improved. And this was generations before they would see professional policing actually coalesce, before they would see the infrastructural improvements of Gaslight, before we would see the sort of complex laws governing all of these things become better unified. And even Brahma himself, within a decade, has this absolutely incredible piece of technology that is, as far as anybody else is concerned, absolutely impervious to attack. And just like with our previous era, this really deeply permeates the culture. You can look at Dickens and his contemporaries, and you'll see references to Brahma locks, well, he definitely couldn't have gotten in here because there was a Brahma on that door, and nobody can get through a Brahma, and so on and so forth. It's kind of similar to the idea of a Brahma lock being on a door in fiction or in crime reporting or whatever the case may be was not dissimilar from that classic and terrible line that we see from in modern procedurals in their home, and somebody eyeballs the door and says, "No sign of forced entry. They must have known the attacker." It is a similar trope in the in Victorian England and pre-Victorian England, Georgian. Anyway, so it very much permeates the culture. It's in their literature. It's in their reporting. It is well known that the Brahma and the Chubb, who is his main competitor, and whose lock came about through a competition that the royal family actually put on, trying to find a lock that was not only impervious, but could also report to you if it had been picked, if somebody had attempted and failed to pick it. So that was the Chubb detector lock. Very clever lock. And the two of them in general are just believed to be completely impervious. Now, as this bleeds into the culture, we have another really, really massive societal transition happening, and that is the change from a primarily rural country to a primarily urban country. And this literally happens in 1851, the same year as the lock controversy of 1851, all of which was coinciding with and the result of the Great Exhibition of 1851. And so in this incredible moment where England very much opens itself up to the world in order to show off that the manufacturing and arts and mostly manufacturing and arts, but science, some other things from their country and their colonies would still far outstrip the rest of the world. At the same moment that they're suddenly becoming a majority urban country where people are learning and have belief in have been learning to live closer and closer together for generations now. New social norms exist just from proximity, that they live together, and that the sort of political, social, cultural power comes now more from cities than it could from rural areas as well. All of that in this moment when the American Alfred Charles Hobbs rolls over there and he picks the Chubb. Now, interestingly, the history of the Chubb, you can actually find old encyclopedia articles on the Chubb that propose that it could be opened in exactly the way that Hobbs would wind up opening it. So that one was always doomed to fall, and it was a very clever attack that he used. He effectively used the detector mechanism against it. He would trigger the detector mechanism, and then the user of the lock would have a different key that would reset the detector. So he would trigger the detector and then reset it. And he would figure out that right below where the triggered was the correct position, that every position would just go off. Really just decoded it and reset the detector and used that to impression the lock. Okay. But he quickly opens the chub. A while thereafter, open the Brahma, and he does it in a very public way. It is, routine papers while he's in the process of trying to open this, a lot of arguments back and forth, and then he finally does it. And soon thereafter, though there is some continuing controversy, hence the Great Lock controversy, he is proven to absolutely open. It took him 15 over the course of 14 days in a 30-day period that had been set aside for this. And so as this happens, we get to witness the death of the ideal of society. Wild. Tutorials, some absolutely beautiful and almost like gut-wrenching writing about the subject. A lot of people saying, well, you better go pick that American's lock now. And that would eventually be done actually by another American. Linus Yale Jr. eventually picks the lock that Hobbes went to England to shill. But in the aftermath of the lock controversy, nobody manages to pick Hobbes' lock. So there is a contingent of people that think, okay, maybe this is the new perfect look, and we can always find the next piece of perfect security technology. But for the most part, people instead choose to reckon with this idea that perfect security had never existed, that we've been sort of given the gift of that knowledge in this moment. And there's, I think it's from the Times of London, a good line that, we once believed that Chubb and Brahma were as impregnable as Gibraltar. Even more so, for the key to the Mediterranean was taken by us some years ago. It seems cruel at this time of day, when we have been taught to look on our bunches of keys with something of a sense of security, to scatter that feeling to the winds. And there's another person writing at the time whose take on this I really loved. And he effectively proposed that we, in this moment, when it has been demonstrated to all of us that perfect security doesn't exist, and if it didn't exist today, it didn't exist a month ago, when we were all still living just this close together, in this proximity, with these social norms and laws and so on and so forth. And he suggests that if perfect security doesn't exist, could we perhaps be moving into a post-lock society, one in which the lock on the door is replaced by trust in the heart? It's a lovely sentiment. And when I first read that, however long ago, when I was a hobbyist lockpicker and not too seriously into any of this yet, I thought, what a doofus. And then I quickly came to genuinely believe that in that moment, they effectively were entering a post-lock society for the majority of society. None of that means that security technologies weren't still explicitly and desperately needed in many situations. But for the most part, people who had a Chubb lock on their door, or some slightly better than average Baron, or the cheapest thing that Brahma offered that could be picked by someone even well before Hobbes did, all of those people ultimately could still trust in the technology on their door, because the technology was backed up by social norms. It was backed up by taboos. It was backed up by it having permeated the culture at all, with this belief in the power of the technology. The lock itself had ceased to be the thing that was keeping most people safe quite a long time ago, even though that was its explicit purpose when it was first invented and first put into the hands of these consumers. Instead, it was totemizing all of the various systems and practices and transformations that had happened in that society in the previous 100 years, so that even when it fell, even when it was potentially deviated, things didn't fall apart. And initially people thought that it would. In fact, if you look at the patent record, the patents filed for locks and other forms of secure door hardware were in the low dozens, I think. afterwards, it absolutely skyrockets. It's an increase of 400, 500, 600%. I don't know. Don't quote me in this talk on it, but you can find what I've written about it before and quote me on it there. So there remains a demand. There are people who want and need quality versions of this technology for sure. But within about 20 years, especially after another world exhibition in France in the late 1860s, when every safe vendor that brought their safe there to have a safe cracking competition, and every single one of them in public got broken into, none of them managed to resist their competitors' machinations, and it was just sort of this, certainly not a free-for-all, but it made it very clear that the way that we now think about security, where we believe any lock that takes the key can be picked, right? This idea is sort of coming into full bloom, and they're also looking around and seeing that, yeah, but things are pretty much the same as they were the day before we found this out 20 years ago. And so our relationship with security technologies in Great Britain and America, and by extension, a lot of the places that both of our countries influence, has very much followed on from that moment. And a lot of our relationships with security technology in general have been informed by that watershed moment. All right, so coming into a more modern era, we've talked about how these technologies and the things that we believe about them and the way that they are put into the world by their manufacturers influence society and create this real effect on how we see ourselves and the ways in which those technologies change how we relate to one another. So in the modern era, I'm not here to give you a history of digital security technologies, but I do want to talk about a handful of things that both differentiate them and make them at times a unique thing in the world to be designing. And also some of the ways in which looking at these past eras and looking at the relationship between security technologies and the development of complex and better secured societies, we should approach some of the more frustrating questions of how digital security engages with actual human beings, and especially systems of government and communities. We should try to approach those as we work on their design, development, and implementation through an anthropological lens. So one of the first massive changes is that, once we have networked computers, securing the connection between the two of them becomes a unique game. We've had encrypted messaging of various forms for a very long time. Back to people, scribbling things on each other's heads and letting the hair grow back. And, we have had encoded messaging between 2 points for an incredibly long time. But quickly computers into, though we often still think about it as just transfers of information, they turn into things that possess significant portions of our tangible lives, and the tangible lives of every individual, right? So we aren't securing points of communication, or most of us are not securing points of communication, between two armies, far flung and on the same side of the same war. While that may have been the case early on, or while that may continue to be the case in certain settings, for the most part, when we are securing communication between my computer and what it's communicating to, and anybody that might fall in between that, or anybody that might attack either endpoint of that, so on and so forth, we are attempting to protect every piece of the same infrastructure that we need to see developed. So while in England in 1770, 1780, people could begin thinking about gaslighting and so on and so forth, and it is a long time before anybody managed to implement this, and another generation before it's in public in any form. But we make our lock and we put it out there because we're not dependent on this infrastructural system to get the lock into people's hands. However, the majority of the security technologies that we're developing for individual consumers are in fact dependent on the infrastructural investments that have already existed. These things have to happen in tandem with one another rather than the technology that you are creating and implementing being a bulwark while that infrastructure is created. Obviously, there are examples where that is in fact the case, where we are, seeing infrastructural improvements in the way that in the entire ecosystem of the internet, while older security technologies are sort of holding the ground, are still acting as that bulwark. But the very fact that you have to create those technologies on and with and evolve with the infrastructural investments makes this a unique era in the history of the development of security technologies. And the implications that are wider ranging than I can easily put into words in a short period of time. But I want you to sort of encode that in your brain and think about the things that affects. In particular, if we look at, we've had a very small handful of recalls of locks in the modern era. Rarely happens, but when it does, a human being has to engage with some professional or some company to physically repair the thing to be installed, so on and so forth. And the majority of, there's a bit of an immunization idea to this as well, because a lot of people in the course of this recall could probably say, meh, if I wait long enough, this solution will be out there enough that people won't think that my home, bike, whatever device, whatever piece of private property is vulnerable to that. If it gets solved for enough people, mine can still be terrible. And it's, potentially a dangerous game. And there's sort of a brief tail where there will be a flurry of activity once it's publicly acknowledged. And then, a lot of the older styles stay out there. Enough of it has improved, and the reliability of whatever the attack has gone down enough that the total harm is reduced enough. But with network security, we are often able to touch, if not the vast majority of the devices that we're trying to secure when we're trying to install that piece of what would be hardware on a lock. But the correlation is, based on my house, urban Vermont, and the unconcerned that has recalled the lock that is on my front door, is that I know that to carry out that attack, somebody would have to come to my door. They wouldn't be able to say, I am going to hit every house in Colchester tonight in the course of half an hour. They can't distribute their attack against a physical space. And this is another way in which, and it's related directly to that infrastructural piece, that developing security technologies is explicitly differentiated from the history of the development of security technologies. Development in the modern era is differentiated from. There are powerful differences. These are important things to think about. I first discovered and had the opportunity to really think about these things when working on responsible disclosures for mechanical security versus the well-established, at that point when I was getting involved, responsible disclosure practices for digital security. And there were just all sorts of other things that we needed to consider. The timelines had to be different. The budget for fixing things, the way in which you inform the people who need the fix, so on and so forth. Like, all of those things take on a different relationship when the fear isn't as explicit and urgent, because you can't attack every user of the lock at once, or vast majorities of them at once, as you can with network security. But additionally, in order to fix and solve the problem, a physical change will have to happen, and a human will have to be present to make that physical change. So it leads to all sorts of interesting discrepancies. But the way model tracks perfectly with the history of that development is in the ways in which it affects culture, the ways in which it allows for the development of complex society, the ways in which by disabling, by preventing access to those robust security technologies for consumers, we risk never allowing the social systems to develop that knit together a community in ways that are significantly more secure. So there are a lot of things down this path. One of the more interesting and one of the big shifts that we've actually seen relatively recently is in how individual people, at least in America, view digital intrusion now. And it is more closely related to how we view physical intrusion. You know, a decade ago, somebody breaking into my home would get a much different response from everybody in my life than somebody breaking into my computer. Now, while we'll still get a different response, there is more empathy, shock, alarm, rage, so on and so forth, which are emotions and responses and cultural touchstones that allow for other things like political will, legislative changes, you know, forcing change to the way in which we modernize policing and investigation of these things and so on and so forth. A lot of this comes from literally just shifting the dynamic of how the individual in the culture is able to talk about these things. And I was at a conference in Virginia probably more than a decade ago at this point. And I was sitting with some medical device researchers, among other folks who were speaking at this conference. And I posed the question to everybody at the table, you know, what will the moment be when people will feel the same way about digital intrusion as they do about physical intrusion? And I think quite compellingly, some of the medical device researchers explicitly said, like, the first malicious death at the hands of somebody hacking a medical device. And I thought, yeah, that's super compelling. That's like a great, you know, thing to sort of hang the societal transition on potentially. But instead, and I mean this quite earnestly, I believe, and some really wonderful work from sociologists, I think, proves this out, that the fappening and the subsequent snapping, not too long later, that happened only in, I don't know, 14, 15, 16, somewhere in there, created massive change in how we perceive digital intrusion. And one of the ways in which that happened was that Jennifer Lawrence explicitly, when her nudes were shared out of her hacked iCloud account, along with so many other people's, when the jokes on late night television started, like they always did when a sex tape came out or somebody's nudes were leaked or whatever the thing was, she explicitly went out and said that this is a crime, this is a sex crime, this is a sex crime that has been perpetrated against me and is re-perpetrated against me every time somebody is accessing these things. And she was adamant about that, and she had the star power to demand that shift in frame for the people that wanted to be able to book her. And as that cultural conversation in late night television and you know, the Today Show and so on and so forth shifted from, well, if it's, you know, don't take the picture if you don't want everybody to see it, which was always the advice before, you know, don't go out dressed like that, all just like proactive victim blaming. As the larger culture took that note and started to shift, you actually saw in the fappening subreddit people coming to terms with this cultural shift, turning on their heel and trying to change the interior culture of the people that were, you know, most promoting and proselytizing all of this, and saying like, yo, we got this wrong, what we are doing is terrible and we need to think this through. And then as sort of the coup de grace on this transformation about how we were going to view these things as a culture, and Lord knows it is still ongoing. But the conversation shifted dramatically. Within a couple of months, there was the snapping, wherein non-celebrities, everyday people, I believe that there were two third-party, Snapchat overlays that would take screenshots without alerting the other party that you had taken a screenshot of their thing. And it turned out that both of these were effectively just harvesting everybody's screenshots in order to put them out in a massive dump layer. Whether it was malicious from the start or if somebody managed to just get into that database photos, I don't remember. For whatever reason, I feel like it was the former. But anyway, so not long after this very public change in perception and this demand that we change the culture, we also see this absolutely massive intrusion in hundreds of thousands of individual lives and these little snapshots into individual lives, which feels worse, right? And more personal and more direct and more like somebody's in your home. So this is for real a moment of significant societal transition, and one that has affected how safe people are on the internet, and it had nothing to do with the technological evolution, but instead has actually spurred all sorts of interesting innovation in spaces that aren't related to the security technology itself. And it will take a long time before all of this plays out. But quite frankly, I genuinely believe that societal shift, another generation from now, will be keeping the majority of us as safe from that sort of intrusion as whatever the actual security technology that we are implementing and making use of in that moment. Now, I want to leave at least a moment for some Q&A, but I do also want to talk briefly about the concept of zero trust. And effectively, what I want to say is it has given us incredible technologies, and it has given us terrible ways to think about security ecosystems. And effectively, I genuinely believe that a generation of security developers that have been insisting that we need to find ways to route around the need for trust have affected not only security design, but may also have affected our culture as a whole, not just the cultures that we try to build online with one another, where trust is often devalued and very difficult to come by, especially because we know from sociology and anthropology that systems of trust and community are dependent on the systems that they are contained by. So your small group, my little writing group here in my tiny town in Massachusetts, which is mostly delightful elderly people, and we get together at the local library when there's not a pandemic on, they get together on Facebook. And Facebook is where they meet and they spend time together, but their cohesion and their ability to trust one another are all tempered by what the platform allows them to do, how it allows them to engage with one another, how it encourages them to be safe or not safe, or so on and so forth. And when we route around the need to trust one another, we lose access to one of the most important ways in which a society becomes more secure in the long run. So the technologies it has given us are brilliant, but the frames of reference that it has given us are potentially toxic. And then finally, that backdoors erode that trust in just the same way. And one of the more interesting things that I think came out of the San Bernardino iPhone case was not so much the ways in which it played out and almost went to court and set legal precedent. All of that is indicative of everything that we're talking about, but it was the dissident security engineers that put their hands up and said, hey, don't turn this into law. I know how to do it. Who might not have raised their hand up previously because that's valuable information to them, but it is this moment of dissident engineering when they're able to explicitly say, like, yo, I can break into that system. Don't you dare make it a law that we should always be able to break into that system. That person is securing both the technology and the society. Okay, I could talk for another 3 or 4 hours on this, I have no doubt, but I would love to take some questions.
Wow. As you were explaining the early years, I kept having visions of Ken Burns and keys, and it's like, man, this would make for an interesting Ken Burns series. I still find it fascinating, even when it comes to our own cybersecurity, because I've always been a big believer of whatever happens in the cyber world happens in the real world. Thinking back to the locks and doors and people breaking into homes and society coming together and saying, yeah, no, that's not a good thing, and where we sit there. So I overall, I just found it fascinating, a really interesting history lesson. So good information. I can't imagine the amount of studying and research and writing that you've done based off of that. That was fantastic. If you guys got any questions, you can unmute or drop it in the chat, and I'll ask Skylar and go from there.
Hey, Skylar. The last part, when you started talking about zero trust, really started to resonate, because that's a very common topic of discussion amongst a lot of security practitioners, and that it's very, very intriguing that you've drawn this perspective of zero trust is really becoming detrimental to our concept of trust and privacy. And you went through it a little quickly there, so I missed some of the finer key points and stuff. But it was the statement you said that our need to when we route around the need to trust each other, we lose the fabric of society that leads to security technologies.
Yeah.
So it's almost like you're alluding that our need for security technologies is kind of will break down because we're losing the need to trust each other.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a lot of really, really good research on high trust versus low trust societies. This, quite frankly, I think is quite in vogue at the moment for some of these same reasons. And I think it's become really in vogue among, it's always, or it has for a long time existed in anthropological and sociological literature. I think it is becoming particularly interesting right now because just like each of those other eras that we talked about, these concepts from security engineering, I mean, literally these words are permeating the larger culture. The idea, I expect that many, many, many people in my life that wouldn't have known the expression a decade ago know the idea of zero trust or of living in a trustless but secure as a result, being able to transact with somebody without trusting them, so on and so forth. And we've also often created social and legal frameworks for this as well. Like the very concept of escrow is a way to route around trust. The problem is that we are once again not securing like my house. We are securing everybody all at once on top of the infrastructure that is also being developed at the same time. And this means that if our defense of that infrastructure is so tied up in not allowing each person to trust each other, in being able to live without trusting each other, we devalue the value of trust. Man, I'm talking in circles, but I have a different hour-long talk only on this one topic. But ultimately what I'm trying to say is the technologies that zero trust thinking has given us are incredible. And I don't just mean from the modern era. I mean, the very concept of escrow is phenomenal. Insurance is a way to provide a layer of trustlessness to a large portion of society where you can act with a little more freedom because you know that there's the safety net. A lot of this stuff comes back to trust. But at the same time, if we look at, I wanted to know a very long time ago if people would be willing to live without locks on their door and how they would feel about not having a lock on their door. And then I thought, well, what would your neighbors feel about you not having a lock on your door? And so gathered a bunch of survey data and ultimately found that, there's some portion of people, and when interviewed, they would respond, about 10% would say like, oh, I would feel safer. And when interviewed, they'd say, well, You don't have to be faster than the bear. You just have to be faster than your friend. And if the person next door isn't using a lock, they're going to break into that house instead of mine. But there was 25% of people that said that they felt less safe. And in talking to some of them, I was very much expecting this broken windows idea, right? That if somebody is being insecure near me, that invites risk, and that then I am then tied up in the risk that they're taking. And there's a flavor of that, but what I got over and over again was not that they personally would feel more at risk, but that they would have to keep better track of their neighbor. They would have to, that their sense of security wasn't isolated to their home or their apartment. It encompassed their neighborhood, their apartment building, their block, whatever the case may be. And the survey data played this out as well, that the further out you expand this, so, if, it turns out that somebody in your town isn't using it, you don't particularly care, it affects your feeling of security much less. So this expansion in geography reduces how unsafe you feel about somebody doing that. And in talking with the respondents, it very much seems to be that there is this great core of people who expand their sense of security. And those people are exactly the people whose values are being lost when we talk about creating zero trust systems. Those are the people who are making massive contributions to how much we can trust each other in small geographic communities. An example of this that one of the people gave me was that when a family in their neighborhood had gone on vacation, they hadn't spoken to anyone in that family. They were pretty sure, just hadn't spoken to them in like 2 years. They weren't really friends, but they were in the same neighborhood. And they went on vacation, and there was a freak snowstorm that nobody expected. And they went over and they shoveled their driveway and right up the block and got all the snow off of the door, because they didn't want anybody driving by and thinking, oh, those people aren't home. Because that is part of their community that they are securing. And those sorts of literal human social systems that develop when we are able to be proximate to one another in the world, I think we are risking not having access to in a digital society that are kept very safely apart from one another in that way, where they don't have to take responsibility for one another.
We start to see, that's very interesting. We start to see some of those similar trends come up with the prolific usage of these Ring doorbells, right? So
Yeah.
like in my neighborhood, every other house has a Ring doorbell on it. And what we're getting is people that are now developing kind of this sense of paranoia a little bit, right? Because bad things happen and you need to have this doorbell. And now I'm seeing everything and I'm checking my alerts every morning when I wake up to see what happened and what happened last night. And now I've got this forum where if I see bad things, I can post, and it tells my neighbors and informs them, hey, this thing happened, not far from your house and stuff. So we start to see that societal impact from that security technology. I
think that is a phenomenal point of reference. I don't have anything to add, but I'm going to take that in my own notes, because I think that's a deep well for myself to dig into. I really appreciate that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry, I was checking my Ring doorbell. I was curious.
Yeah.
See what was going on. Clark Howard recently said everyone should have a dash cam to see why I cover your butt. Yeah, no kidding. Wow. Skylar, thank you very much. Great information. Like I said, interesting history lesson, and just kind of, I always feel we got to make sure we look back across history so we don't repeat our mistakes.
Yeah. And again, as I hope I made clear, it isn't a direct analog, but those societal impacts, I genuinely believe we have a lot to learn. Yeah. How the technology develops and what you have to do to keep things safe. It's a different game than we've ever had before. I think it is important for us to differentiate that, because if I see the metaphor of the lock used really poorly a lot. And we need to identify that it's a different thing that we're building now, but at the same time, we're trying to build it in the same society.
Same society, yeah. Cool. Very good. All right. Well, again, thank you very much, Skylar, and to Sean for your info and the presentation tonight. Everyone will, if you've provided us your ISC squared number, there will be 2 CPEs awarded to you for this evening. I haven't opened up registration yet for April, but it will come soon, hopefully in the next week. Definitely get an email. Plus, if you're interested in running for president or secretary, put your name in, send the email in. Otherwise, thank you very much, everybody, for taking time out of your Monday evening and joining us. And hopefully we're able to take away for some stuff. And have yourself an awesome week. And we will see you all next month in April.
Don't forget to stop recording.